And here you can see something's different about God's name. It looks like, to me, that it's even in a different hand. It's certainly smaller. In the second instance, in the first instance, it's big. So it started to seem to me that these were filled into blank spaces. What I'm going to present today is, it's actually a chapter in my PhD dissertation that I did under Professor Yosef Ofer. It was published as an article in the Journal of Jewish Studies. And I'm only going to get to a small amount of what's in that article because it's, I think, 9,000 words or something. I started to notice when I was looking at the Torah Scrolls, and let me back up. I was looking at the name of God for my PhD dissertation. It has all kinds of special halachot around it, some of them very ancient. And I noticed I had gone through all the photographs of the Russian National Library, something like 90,000 pages, looking for anything with God's name. And I realized I had hundreds, actually thousands of shelf marks of codices, and I only had 2 Torah Scrolls. So I started scouring the world before the pandemic, looking for Torah Scrolls. Here is a fragment from the Cairo Geniza, from Lewis Gibson collection, 10th, 11th century, Oriental, unless Judith tells me otherwise. And here you can see something's different about God's name. It looks like, to me, that it's even in a different hand. It's certainly smaller. In the second instance, in the first instance, it's big. So it started to seem to me that these were filled into blank spaces. That was my hypothesis. Here's another example. And here, I think it's definitely could be a different hand. It's always difficult to know because we have 3 letters, right? It's 4, but there's 2 hays, so that doesn't help you, right? So you have 3 letter forms. One of them is Yud, one of them is Vav, which is pretty generic. How do you know if it's a different handwriting or the same handwriting? And that's where my interaction with Ira and Zena and Greg at the BOM was so important, because we could actually look and see, wait a minute, is this ink the same as this ink? And it's not just speculation. We can actually get scientific answers. So this is a Ashkenazi Torah scroll. The other ones were Oriental. This is 14th century Rotolo Duo at the Vatican. And here you can see, you actually can't see in the photo that there's a slightly, and I have to be careful not to use the word color, because color has a technical meaning in science, but this is actually a different hue when you see it in person. Hue, that's more safe. But clearly God's name was squeezed into a blank space. I say clearly, but I don't know, maybe not. Maybe when it came to God's name, he said, I have 2 more words left in the line. I'm going to squeeze it in, and they'll write Elohim afterwards. It's possible, right? This isn't the only instance, though. Here, clearly, this is, I think, Judith, by the way, discovered this, if I'm not mistaken, in Krakow. Am I right? Another Ashkenazi Torah scroll. Here, it's, I'm quite certain, a different hand, meaning it wasn't the main scribe who wrote it. Certainly, he used what appears is an important word as well, what appears to be a different ink. I can't say it's a different ink without shooting, as I say, zapping it with X-rays, or Xena zapping it with X-rays. To me, it looks like a different ink, based on visual observations. That's the safe phrase. Here, Sephardi Torah scroll. When we say 16th century or later, we really have no idea when it's from. We just mean it's after the period of 1540, when the Hebrew Paleography Project and other projects kind of had their cutoff time. So this could be 19th century for all I know, unless somebody tells me otherwise. God's name is clearly different. And in this case, it's very interesting. There's the inseparable preposition, which is the same as everything else. And when they get to God's name, it looks like it's written in a second phase. I mean, the spacings are kind of ridiculous. There's this big space after it. The size, it looks even like it was written with a different writing implement. Now, here in the Cairo Geniza is an example where this was apparently a writing exercise. Why do I say it's a writing exercise? Because he didn't finish. This isn't a complete Torah scroll, and he didn't write God's name. And what's really beautiful here is the second from the top there. You can see he has the lamed of the inseparable preposition. That he wrote, because that's treated completely differently than the letters of God's name, Yud, Hey, Vav. But by the way, in the last example, or 2 examples ago, it wasn't just Yud, Hey, Vav, it was also the word Elohim, right, or Elohechem in this instance. So, and that's actually a debate in rabbinical literature. Do these rules apply only to the Tetragrammaton, the Shem Meforash, or does it apply to all the titles of God, which includes, Ehiyah, Shireh, and Shaddai, Elohim, etc.? I say etc., but there's only 7 of them, so. I'm going the wrong way here. So here's a really beautiful example from the Cairo Geniza. Here he filled in God's name, and then up there and down here he didn't. So at a certain point he stopped. And so that proves, I think, the hypothesis that I had before, that God's name was filled into blank spaces. So what are the reasons for doing this? So I looked through rabbinical literature, and what I found were 3 different reasons. Number 1, the scribe is distracted, and we'll get to why that's important. Number 2, the scribe is ritually, and this is why he isn't writing God's name and comes later. Number 2, he's ritually unclean. And number 3, which is very surprising, it's certainly not something I would have expected, he needs a quorum of 10. He needs something like a minyan in order to write God's name in their presence. So we'll start with Gittin 54b, any Torah scroll in which the divine name, and here's where the debate comes in the Middle Ages. What are azkarot? Are azkarot only Yud He Vav He, or is it all of the 7 unerasable names of God? Shemot she'enan nimchakim. As it's a machloket, which the divine names were written without proper intent, lishman, is not worth anything. And there's a whole case there in the Gemara where a scribe comes and he says, I wrote this Torah scroll, but I wasn't thinking about that God's name is holy when I wrote it. And that's the whole idea of lishman, that when you write God's name, you have to be thinking, I'm writing a sacred word. And actually, over time, that actually evolves what that means. In later times, you have to actually say some kind of verbal formula. Originally, apparently, it meant, I'm writing Yud He Vav He as God's name, as opposed to something else. Well, what else? So in Masechet Sofrim, it talks about, in the story of Micah in Judges, at the end of Judges, there are 3 instances where it has the letters Yud He Vav He, but it refers to an idol. And so those names can be erased. They're not sacred. So when I write it in somewhere else, what am I thinking about? Am I thinking about the idol of Micah, or am I thinking about the creator of the universe, right? Or am I thinking about I had a fight with my wife this morning, right? That's seriously, if I'm distracted in some way, then, although I never fight with my wife, but in principle. So Sofrim says, a scribe who is writing the divine name, even if the king greets him, he must not respond. So you're doing an important thing. You're writing God's name. Don't deal with, even if it's a king who you could be killed, later they said, okay, don't get killed, right? So they change it to a king of Israel, because he'll understand. A non-Jewish king, if you don't respond, you'll be murdered, executed. If a scribe was writing 2 or 3 names at once, he should stop between them and respond to the greeting. So this is in 2 places, in Sofrim and Sefer Torah. This part of Sofrim is based on Masechet Sefer Torah. So what is this, writing 2 or 3 names at once? Beautiful, this is my practice. He wrote a whole sheet of the Torah scroll, and he left the blank spaces, and he came to fill them in, right? And this is a relatively early source. Sofrim is dated to the 8th century. Masechet Sefer Torah, some say it's even, the core of it is from the Tannaitic period, possibly. So this is beautiful. I found my practice. I didn't find examples from this period because we don't have Torah scrolls, but it could be referring to my practice. But writing 2 or 3 names really could be interpreted 2 different ways, and it is, as everything in Jewish sources is. It could be filling in blank spaces, which is what we're talking about, but maybe it's 2 or 3 names in a row. And you say, what's 3 names in a row? Shema Yisrael, Yud He Vav He, Eloheinu, Yud He Vav He Echad. So that's, well, you say, wait a minute, Eloheinu. Yeah, according to one opinion, Azkarot includes the word Eloheinu. So that, or it's in Exodus 34, verse 6, it's Yud He Vav He, El Rachum V'Chanun. That's 3 names in a row. Okay, so how do we know which one it is? I obviously want it to be the first one, because that proves my practice goes back to the Tannaitic times. The Jerusalem Talmud is what I wrote most of my article about because of the words here. So now it's presented as a braita. What we saw in Sofrim is a braita. This king who's writing the name, same thing here, 2 or 3 divine names, and it says, Kigon El Elohim Hashem. So it's 2 or 3 names in a row, clearly, right? Unless that was added, right? So that's what my article is about. I'm not going to get into it. I don't have time, but it's okay if it's added, because I have Tosefta Brachot, where it doesn't matter what it says in Yerushalmi, meaning there's a version of the Braita in Yerushalmi which stands on its own, but there's also one in Brachot. it says he must not respond if a scribe was writing 5 or 6 divine names at once. So now you can't say it's Shema Yisrael, right? It doesn't work. There are instances of 6 names, but not in the Torah. It's in later in the Tanakh. And that's if you include things other than Yehovah as Azkarot, right? So even if the Yerushalmi is talking about writing names in a row, which the words Kigon, El Elohim Hashem seem to indicate, although maybe that's an interpolation, right? I come from biblical studies. You can always say something's an interpolation. That's our bread and butter. So here it doesn't matter. Here 5 or 6 divine names is clearly scattered throughout the page because you don't ever have that in a row in a Torah scroll. So now we jump forward to the Middle Ages, and we have Rabbi Yonatan of Lunel, who is in Lunel, I believe, is in southern France. And it's a commentary on the Rif, on the Halachot, right? Who's quoting is incorporating the Braita. He explains he skipped many divine names on the sheet. He did not want to write them, Shahayat Terud, because he was troubled. He had a fight with his wife that morning. He was troubled at that time. So he left them blank, and now he has returned to write them all at once, right? So maybe you don't always do it. Maybe you only do it if you woke up and you have a cold and you're like, oh, I can't think about God's name, but I got to do my job or my family doesn't eat. Now, pay attention to the word terud there. That's important. So here is Rabbi Yosef Chaviva, who I believe is Catalonian, and he says, for example, he skipped many divine names in the sheet. He did not want to write them because he was not ritually clean at that time. So he left them blank and now has returned them to write them all at once. So both are commentaries on the Rif, Halachot, which is then incorporating the Braita, right? So both interpretations exist. And he says, Shelo hayat tahor. And of course, coming from biblical studies, first thing that jumps out to me is that tahor and tarud are graphically nearly identical. And it's hard for me to believe that one of these is not a scribal error for the other. Of course, I have no way of knowing which is original and which is a scribal error, but maybe not. Maybe both are authentic. Now, the thing about troubled, where does that come from? We saw in Gittin that if you don't write a name Lishman, the name's Lishman, for the sake of it being a divine name, then the scroll isn't valid. So that's the troubled part, ritually clean. Why would you need to be ritually clean? Well, this is something to this day in the 21st century. I've spoken to scribes who say, before I write God's name, that morning I go to the mikvah. Do you do that? Or? Yeah. So there's actually a modern work dispute about this, where there was, and it involved seamstresses. And this is in the 21st century, there was a modern work dispute, and they cited a 20th century work dispute where a scribe was hired to write a Torah scroll. And although it's not required that he go to the mikvah to write the name, it's just a custom. Everyone agrees on that, as far as I know. He agreed that for this Torah scroll, he would go to the mikvah each time and write the names. And then the mikvah broke down, and he had to travel several miles away. And he says, I want more money. I want the time that it takes me to travel. And so they asked the Shaila, and the determination was, because it's not an actual requirement, when he agreed to write the names based on the given price, that was assuming he didn't have to travel because he had a nearby mikvah. And then they cited this in the 21st century in a work dispute about seamstresses, that if they have to travel far, then you have to pay them for their travel time. So this is something still around. Sofrim, I found an Ashkenazi manuscript from the 13th century of Sofrim, where it says if a scribe was writing 2 or 3, and the scribe originally wrote places, and then he realized that's a mistake, because why does he write places? He's thinking of blank spaces. And he realizes, oh no, it's supposed to be names. This is what it looks like. It's beautiful. So how do you erase it? He put dots over it, right? And as he's writing, right, this isn't later he figures it out. Mikomot, he writes, and he changes it to Shemot, right? So this is, and that makes sense, because we have Ashkenazi Torah scrolls from this period where they're leaving blank spaces. All right, I think I'm gonna, Here, Rabbi Avram ben Isaac of Narbonne, we have heard that there are currently many scribes who do not initially write the divine names, but leave blank spaces for them. Okay, so that's what we found in practice, and here he's talking about it. When they finish writing the entire Torah scroll, they purify themselves and then write all the divine names. There are also some of them who convene a prayer quorum when they, and he doesn't say prayer, I added that, when they write the divine names. We do not know, and it is not clear to us, nor to me, the reason for this custom, for we have not found it in the Talmud. So the idea of you have to concentrate, that comes from Gittin 54b. Where does this come from? Don't know. It's a custom that's just around. And then Hilchot Sefer Torah, I'm going to skip this same sort of thing. Here he tells you the purpose is to focus, the gathering the 10 men is to focus his intent. And then here in Sefer Hasidim, he talks about the ancients used to write Torah scrolls by inscribing the divine names in the presence of 10 righteous men. Now, this morning I read a blog post by Annette Martini, who talks about this passage as well. I think it just came out in May. And she interprets this instead of the, and if this is wrong during the Q&A, you'll correct me. In the presence of 10 righteous men, from what I read, at least in the blog post, she interprets it as by 10 righteous men, which from what I understand is maybe the 10 men each have to write. One of them, I don't know, it's possible. It sounds crazy, right? Except I've seen modern Torah scroll, not modern, I've seen Torah scrolls from a few hundred years ago, early modern Torah scrolls, that there were parts of it that seemed like they were written by patrons, right? You had the scribe write most of the scroll, and you get to the end of a section or a book or something, and then someone who's not a professional scribe is finishing the last line. And that's a way of involving people in the process. So I don't know. So now I've got to keep my eyes open. I'd never thought of that interpretation. It says ba'asarat tzadikim. I understood that with asarat tzadikim, but maybe it means they actually write it. So now I've got to keep my eyes open for Torah scrolls where I'm seeing different hands writing God's name. I've never seen that, but could be out there. So Erfurt 7, and I'm almost done here. I don't know if you can see it here, but God, Yehovah Elohim, and here you can see the space after Elohim, looks different. Based on visual observations, it looks different. I did a study with Ira's team, and we wrote a couple of papers about it. Here's the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't have time to, somebody asked me about this in the Q&A. So here was Erfurt 7. There were some sheets weren't original. They're replaced, 3 of them. And on those, we had God's name. Now, in the original sheets of Erfurt 7, God's name is only different in the first sheet and a half. The first column and a half, it's different. The rest of it, God's name is written as the scribe is writing, not afterwards. How do I know that? I demonstrated it in my article based on some of the errors that were made. I can see from corrections of errors that he's writing God's name in the rest of the scroll as he's writing the rest of the text, but only in the first column and a half, does he write God's name separately. But in the replacement sheet, you can see God's name, the headline is lower, and it has a slightly different orientation, and the letters are smaller. And what I noticed is there's 2 corrections on the same sheet that look awfully lot like, now it's only 3 letters, right? Yud, Hey, and Vav, right? Because the Hey is twice. But it looks awfully a lot like Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, these 2 corrections. So I asked the question to Ira's team, is this ink of God's name different than this ink? And is it the same as this ink? And Greg will talk about that. It's one of the most exciting things I've ever been part of. We ended up writing a really important paper about it, which was, wasn't this cited in the journal Nature, which is pretty cool. And that is it. So any questions?
Questions about Torah Scrolls making it to nature.
Yeah.
That's absolutely amazing. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
There are probably questions. Mark?
I think you didn't mention about rabbis writing why not to do this, that they leave out money.
So this is very important.
So, because what I want to say that, for
very
example,
important.
Chesed Sofer from the 19th century, he says exactly why not to. He says that it's good to go to the mikveh before every name, or sometimes some Sofrim do it, not every single name, but leave out, as you said, for a sheet. But he says that it shouldn't be done for a long text, like the whole Sefer.
So this is an excuse to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you so much. Oh, wait, what happened? So here in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a quote from Isaiah, and God's name is missing.
Then it's a long time, maybe he didn't go to a software store like today
Yeah.
But every time he made his new ink,
Yeah.
so after a long time, maybe a year, he
Yeah.
goes to the mikveh, and then his ink that he made new is different. That's what we see.
Exactly.
So there's an issue in the Talmud which is specifically talking about writing God's name without the proper intent. And then it says, okay, just trace over it, right? Go and write, every time is Yehovah, write over it with the intent, and you don't have to start from scratch. And they say, no, then the scroll will be menumar, which means brindled or speckled, like a namer, a leopard. And so this is really important. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have, for example, 11Q Psalm A, where God's name is written in Paleo-Hebrew letters, and the intention, the goal here is for it to stand out and look different. No question about it. Why? That's a whole different question. But the goal is for it to stand out and look different. That's why it's written in a different script. In rabbinical literature, that's forbidden. It's not supposed to stand out and look different. Now, I showed you all the examples at the beginning where it looks different. And that was not the intent. That was a byproduct. That was actually a bad thing from their perspective. Now, one of the things I learned from Ira's team is that, so we looked at some of the examples and the ink was a different hue, but maybe when it was written, it was the same identical shade as all the words around it, and they just decayed differently over time. This morning, Lior showed me a Torah scroll from Spain, where he thought God's name was erased, was scratched out. But no, it was clear to me that it was just written in a separate stage. You could see from the spacing, probably by a different scribe who used different ink. And over the centuries, it decayed differently. So it looks very pale, and the words around it were preserved much better. So this is a big difference between the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so this is an ancient practice of writing God's name in the second stage, but it's done in a very different way. So, for example, we have this story in the Tannaitic sources, a Braita about the Torah Scroll of the Alexandrians, that they wrote God's name in gold ink. And the rabbis declared it, they said it should be put in a geniza. Why should it be put in a geniza? Because it stands out, and you're only allowed to write in black ink. But here, and we actually have one Dead Sea Scroll that Daniel Stokel Ben Ezra, if he's here, I don't know. Okay, so he just discovered another fragment where the word Elohim is written in red ink, in Paleo-Hebrew letters. So they wanted it to stand out. Whereas in the Middle Ages, they weren't allowed to have it stand out, right? That was, if they did, it was unintentional and undesirable. So although it's a very ancient practice, it has a different way of doing it, yes.
There was one question before they are.
All the scribes are getting
Just something you might want to consider, because you mentioned it might be a different hand. My teacher's teacher, he would do this. He would go to the mikvah and he would leave the spaces, but he would also have a separate Hashem quill. And because it was a separate one, whenever you cut a quill, it's never exact. So quite often you work your way to the bottom of the unwood. You don't want to cut, because you know it's going to be slightly different, and you start again on a new unwood and you'll cut it and trim it. But he would do that. And I had problems with that because it is, you shouldn't really do that because it stands out. But it might be it's the same scribe, but with a different implement that he's keeping separate.
Okay. Very possible. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hartmann Stegemann proposed this idea of a special God's name writer, right? He said there was a certain person in the Dead Sea Scrolls community. He just made this up. He has no evidence whatsoever. But he said there's a separate person who came along who was qualified to write God's name, and he proposes as a possibility. And this is an important difference between what we do and what they do is, everything that we do is this is a possibility, we think, it seems. And what they do is we determined, right? And we have a lot of conflicts over this because I always want to talk about scribes and they always want to talk about inks. If I have a different apparent handwriting and it's added and it's a different ink, to me that's almost certainly a different scribe. And I'm comfortable with almost certainly, and they're not. So.
And you have to take into account that Hartmann Stegemann is a German. So he needs another Sitzenleben to make the story closer.
No, it's very possible. I mean,
Who knows? Leo.
Yeah, just a comment, I guess, on the requirement for a quorum for writing the divine names.
Yeah.
That what's puzzling I think with the source that they're expressing their amazement at this is that there doesn't seem to be any source for as you said, for acquiring a quorum for writing the divine name. But the places that we find the requirement for quorum, a minyan, 10 men, are in prayer. Yeah? But in the prayer, you don't need a quorum of 10 men for the entire time of the prayer. There are only selected parts within the prayer where you actually require the quorum of 10 men, and those are referred to by the Talmud and the Poskim as the Davar Sheba Kedusha.
Okay.
Davar Sheba Kedusha, that's what you require. So it seems to be quite clear that this is an extension of that since the writing of the divine name will proceed as a Davar Kedusha, and the Talmud says that you need a quorum for a Davar Sheba Kedusha. I think must be the logic.
Think about the practicality.
You know, when you're sitting and doing your work, can you have 10 people around you all the time? Like that's what I suspect happened with, and I'm making stuff up, right? But what I suspect happened with Erfurt 7 in the beginning, where it's only the first comma and a half where God's name is written separately, and in the rest he's writing it toch kadei as he's writing. So maybe as he's dedicating the beginning of writing the scroll, he gets a bunch of people together, and he says, all right, well, we're going to fill in God's name while you're standing here. But I can't do that for the entire Torah scroll, right? It's 50 sheets, 150 columns in this case. They'd have to be sitting there for a year, unless he's doing it in a Beit Midrash, I suppose, right?
Yeah,
But it's possible that the first 1.5 column, he still had the original ink, and then it was finished.
By the way, the ink there is darker, but it's the same ink with almost an identical elemental composition, although through semi-quantitative analysis, don't ask me what that means, it was determined that it was a separate batch.
So, all right.
Good. And the last question, Beren.
Thank you. In the Caribbean prayer books, especially the early Palestinian traditions, some of them use the Shema Meforash in the prayer book, some only in biblical passages, and I said several of them, they don't tend to do that. So I was wondering how common is this phenomenon?
Very uncommon.
Or is it?
So I only found it in 2% of the Torah Scrolls / fragments I looked at. So it's relatively uncommon. Now, it could be in 50% it was done, but they were so skilled that I can't tell. I can only tell when they're not all that skilled and they're coming, or maybe they didn't care that much, right? And they're squeezing it in, right? And they didn't calculate how big it needed to be, right? But it was only detectable and clearly detectable, easily detectable in 2%. Yeah, very small.
All right.
Thank you very much, Nehemia, for this.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.